It's time to let your sports opinions fly for the main event. A 7-team elimination match to decide the District 4 3A Championship. Presented to you live by PilotPointBearcats.com. This 10-week match has been sanctioned by the University of Interscholastic League. Our celebrity referee for the District 4 3A show is none other than the daytime psychology professor, Texas high school football storyteller, North Texas insider, and DFW Inside High School Sports, the most feared member of the Texas high school mafia, the one, the only, small-town Dixie, the professor,
I still love that intro every week. Thank you to our friends at the Pilot Point Bearcat Blogging Network for that amazing introduction. I am the Professor Matt Diggs, and welcome to episode 15 of the District 4 3A podcast. And what a blessing it is that we are guaranteed at least 2 more episodes of the District 4 3A podcast this week and next week, and maybe we'll even take it to the state championships like we did last year, but who knows? That's a little presumptuous, but we were definitely given some treats last week, and we have a main event of epic proportions. If you're going to have a WrestleMania type matchup in the district play, now we are basically on a big stage. We are our own pay-per-view. It is live and in living color at Collins Stadium on Thursday night with Whitesboro and Brock. Game 2, Part 2, however you want to refer to it. We get the rematch that we have been wanting to see since that fateful October night where 1 yard, 1 inch was the difference between winning and losing for both teams. But to understand how we are going to get there on Thursday night, we have to again understand where we've been. And let's start out with Brock versus Bushland. And that is definitely a game where I got some flack because at the point where it was 27-7 and Bushland was driving to potentially go up 5 scores at that point, or actually I guess that'd be 4 scores at that point, I was starting to wonder, I wonder where Bushland and Whitesboro would play in a hypothetical matchup. But they were able to they did not score on that drive. They went out on downs deep in their own territory, deep in Brock's territory, about to score. 4th down was just too long for them. Brock was able to get a field goal before halftime, and that score was 27-10 at halftime. How did that score get to be 27-10 at halftime? Well, it was really about Brock and turnovers in that situation. We saw Tanner Adams start the scoring for Bushland at the 6:53 mark, and they made it 7-0. But Brock came back very quickly. Tyler Moody found Jackson Hart down the field to make it 7-7. Then Bushland was able to get back. Dawson Jaco found Cole Purcell for a 46-yard long play. It was 14-7. And then we started to see the turnovers kick in, and then you saw Dawson Jaco score a 71-yard pass to Jake Suggs to make it 20-7. Again, another turnover, and then it was 27-7. And then you see yet another turnover, and then a situation where Bushland was trying to drive to go up 34-7, but again, as we talked about, they did not. They had an incomplete pass on 4th down, and then Brock was able to hit a 31-yard field goal. Interesting halftime speech that was somewhat viral in the world of our. It was mentioned that at halftime, the halftime Coach Mathis said something to the effect of, "We're going to light them up in the second half." And light them up they did. 41 straight points from that point on, and 44 points from the point where it was 27-7 and Bushland was driving to go up 34-7, which would have been a 4-score lead. But Brett Tutter, we've been talking about his excellence. He had a 45-yard touchdown and then a field goal by Brody Baker to make it 27-20. Reed Watkins was able to tie it up late in the third quarter to make it 27-27. And then a big play, Tyler Moody to Carson Finney for 70 yards to give them the lead. Another Brody Baker field goal made it 37-27 in the last 4 minutes of the game. Obviously, Bushland was going for broke, and Brock scored the last 2 touchdowns in the last 4 minutes of the game. Reed Watkins runs. Reed Watkins, I can say that 5 times fast. 2 5-yard runs to make it 44-27, and then ultimately 51-27. In some ways, the game was a little bit closer than it appeared. If you took those 2 touchdowns away the last couple of minutes, typically in regular formation, you're probably not going to go for it on 4th and 15 from your own 11-yard line. Generally not something that is high risk in the playbook, but Brock was able to take advantage of it. Brock only had 372 yards despite having 50 points. Again, the 3 turnovers, 2 fumbles, and an interception were obviously issues in that ideology for Brock, that they struggled in the first half holding on to the ball and throwing interceptions. Dawson Jaco had a nice game, ultimately 16 of 37. And you started to see the incompletions really rein in the second half. The numbers were much better in the first half. 2 touchdowns and an interception. What Brock was able to do that they've been doing all season is shutting down the run game at a significant level. After those first 4 games where you really saw like Texarkana, Pleasant Grove, and Wimberley just put it to them on the ground, their defensive line and front 7 were able to step up against more appropriate competition, and they were able to keep things more everything in front of them. Ivan Soto only had 18 carries for 65 yards. Tanner Adams, 1 carry for 18 yards and a touchdown. And Dawson Jaco, after you added up all the yards from sacks and whatnot, he only accounted for 1 yard on 8 carries and a touchdown. So Brock was another efficient game. And again, we're talking about playoff Brett Tutter, and playoff Brett Tutter was definitely at its peak, 9 carries for 83 yards and a touchdown. Reed Watkins had 12 carries for 56 yards and 3 touchdowns. And Tyler Moody had an effective game for passing the ball, 17 for 31 and 2 touchdowns and 1 interception in his statistical outreach. Carson Finney had 3 catches for 80 yards, including the big play for a touchdown. Jackson Hart, 2 receptions for 35 yards and a touchdown. We know one of those was a big touchdown play as well. And then defensively, Cooper Massey with a really good game with 6 tackles, 5 solos, and Zach Brewster with a tackle and a half for a loss, and Cam Harris with a tackle and a half for a loss. And Trace Roger also had a nice game. Heard him in an interview at the end of the game when I was checking out the Brock postgame show, because the Brock postgame show is now always must listen to radio because you never know what's going to be said. And if you go back and listen to the Bushland Brock game, you might find some bulletin board material there. It's not from Jaden, the Brock sideline reporter who editorialized on Whitesboro a little bit, to the players who feel like that they have something to prove against Whitesboro coming up. Whitesboro took on Paradise and won very handily, 42-14 in the game. The game that is almost doesn't tell the story, because ultimately Austin Iglesias, the really good quarterback for Paradise that made that team go, was reported to be in a walking boot at the end of the shallow water game. I don't know at what point that he got injured in that game. It was pretty late, but people said that they saw him walking in a walking boot before they left the field. So obviously that was a pretty good indicator that something was problematic. And once he was ruled out for this game, I think it was pretty evident that Whitesboro was going to be a pretty big favorite in the game. Aiden Winters for Paradise had to step in at a sophomore, and they tried to do some interesting things, try to get the ball down the field, but he threw for 4 interceptions, and you wouldn't expect anything less, against a Whitesboro defense that's really found its stride the last 6 weeks since that Brock game. They've been playing at a very high level, and a sophomore coming into the game to play quarterback for the first time this year in the third round of the playoffs against a district foe who has already beaten you, that's a tough ask for anybody. He also ran the ball 16 times for 23 yards. Once you neutralized Austin Iglesias as a running threat, the other running backs weren't able to really step in. Will Johnson only had 5 carries for 15 yards. Darren Loper actually had the best game for Paradise. Most of that in the second half, 4 carries for 64 yards. Leo Hernandez, 3 carries for -1 yards, and Isaiah Jennings, 2 carries for 5 yards. For Whitesboro, Mac Harper, again, a very efficient gamesman-like afternoon for the senior, 10 for 13, 123 yards and a touchdown. Grayson Ledbetter, 12 carries for 158 yards. Mac Harper carried the ball 19 times for 68 yards and a touchdown. Max Parker had 6 carries for 28 yards and a touchdown. Also had a punt return touchdown earlier in the game. Carter Sluter also carried the ball for 2 yards. And then Brett Donaldson, 4 for 59. Grayson Ledbetter caught the ball out of the backfield, 1 for 14. Our guy Clay, 1 for 14. Jay Sanders, 1 for 4. Carter Sluter, 3 for 32. And in the game, Clay got to take the final knees in victory formation for Whitesboro after handing the ball off a couple of times. Some great cleanup action for Clay. So it was fun to watch that, and it was fun to get to be down there on the field for the end of the game and some of that celebration. The game was 21-0 at halftime. 35-0 at the end of the third quarter, and Whitesboro was definitely not raining it on. It was 42-0, and they pulled the starters, where Paradise scored their last and only 2 touchdowns of the game to make it 42-14. Whitesboro didn't have to show a lot in this game because they didn't have to. I think Paradise was kind of defeated before they got on the field. Obviously, when you're best player at a small school level, you got to have the depth. You got to have good luck in the playoffs and things like that. But Austin Iglesias was really the heart and soul of Paradise. But he's only a junior. He'll be back next year, and I think Paradise will be a better team. So that brings us to our ultimate main event, the Andre the Giant versus Hulk Hogan battle of the two behemoths, and I think it's going to be my goal. I was criticized, and maybe fairly so, or maybe unfairly, who knows, for talking in circles last time Brock and Whitesboro played. And really, it's hard to pick these games because there are things I like about Brock and there are things I like about Whitesboro. If you remember here on the District 4 3A report last week, I said that last week, if Whitesboro, if they were playing that game last week, I would have picked Whitesboro over Brock. But I believe that Brock has a higher ceiling and kind of a turbo mode. And could they hit that turbo mode button in week 3 that makes me believe in week 4 that they had the opportunity to carry that turbo mode over and to make it to the next level. And really thought a lot about it and did some research, and we'll kind of break down where I thought on that. But there's a lot I like about Brock. On some ways, I know a lot of the Whitesboro fans are very annoyed at the Brock bravado and kind of the shooting from the hip that Coach Mathis does. To be honest, I kind of like it. That's just my personality as a wrestling fan. Somebody who does not engage in coach speak obviously has a very good rapport with the Brock Sports Radio Network to where he feels he can be honest with him and the fans, even though that's going out and it's going to be screen captured and passed around the District 4 3A coaching staffs. A few weeks ago, he said he's going to stomp everybody's guts in district, and ultimately, other than 2 games, they did pretty much stomp everybody's guts in district. And then at halftime, he told everybody he was going to light up Bushland in the second half, and sure enough, they did light up Bushland in the second half. So some people are turned off by that level of, speak in that level of honesty. But I like that out of him. But I also like what Coach Fagan does. Coach Fagan, even though a lot of people in Brock have that picture of him running after the referees in his cowboy boots, he's the kind of coach who prays with his team, and he speaks truth to them. And I like that too. There's a lot that Coach Fagan and Coach Mathis are very polar opposite personalities, but each element of who they are very likable. That Brock would run through a brick wall for their coach, and that Whitesboro would run through a brick wall for Coach Fagan. They both do things. Both are family men of God. Obviously, speak truth to their teams and uplift their teams in a way that they feel is congruent with their personality. And there's a lot to like about each element of that. I know the Whitesboro people probably prefer Coach Fagan and the way he does things, and Brock really enjoys that rejuvenation and that kind of bravado that Coach Mathis provides them. So there are pros and cons to each of those things and each of the way that those coaches go about doing things. But in breaking down the game, the very first question I asked myself last week was, did I see something in this 41-point comeback that allows me to believe that Brock has figured it out? And again, like I said, when you go through the play-by-play and you go through the statistics, Brock scored 14 points at the end of the game, only having to go 16 yards. I mean, they had one drive start at the 11 and one drive start at the 5, and the one that started at the 5, they almost didn't get a touchdown there, and Bushland was probably feeling the wave of momentum get down there. So even though you can't change the score, I can at least mentally in my assessment kind of say, okay, these two touchdowns really didn't count. And then it was 37-27. Then I think about Shallow Water and Bushland. Shallow Water beat Bushland by 15 in a game that Shallow Water was up 27-7 at halftime, very similar to what happened with Brock and Bushland, except they were able to hang on. And Bushland scored a couple of late touchdowns. In the second half, they won 21-16 to make the game a little more respectable. But Shallow Water had done their business in the first half and took care of business. And we saw that Paradise beat Shallow Water, even depending on how long their quarterback was out. Their defense was able to shut Shallow Water down in such a way to where they won that game 17-14. We know that when Whitesboro and Paradise played straight up, even though it was a little bit of in a rainstorm, Whitesboro pretty much dominated Paradise defensively and was able to win that game 18-7. And we know that if it weren't for a fourth down roughing the kicker call, Brock wasn't even going to beat Paradise. So when you look at all of those things and then look at that ending of the game, was it enough? I don't think it was enough for me to see anything different or to notice anything different. But when I look at what happened from Whitesboro versus Brock on, I see a Whitesboro offense that has continued to play at a high level. They scored 69 against Ponder, 60 against Vernon, 65 against Dalhart, and they scored 42 against Paradise, which easily could have been 56 or more. And that's a Paradise team that had not been giving up that kind of offense. Their defense had not been giving up those kind of numbers at all. When you look at Paradise defensively this season, they gave up 7, 13, 15, 14, 14, and that was 15 to Godley. I mean, they beat Godley, a team that was in the third round of the playoffs, and could have gone even higher against Monahans. Godley lost that game 62-55 to Monahans in the third round of the playoffs in 4A Division II, and they held Godley to 15. They gave up 14 to Millsap, 14 to Ponder. Pilot Point was the only one that really got some offense going against Paradise, putting up 34. They only gave up 12 to Boyd, 14 to Peaster, 18 to Brock, and then they gave up 18 to Whitesboro in a pretty good defensive showing. And then they beat Breckenridge 47-7 and Shallow Water 17-14. So this was a Paradise team that played really good defense all year, and Whitesboro was just able to go right at them and then dominate them. And Whitesboro, again, when you look at Paradise versus Brock, that's a game that Again, you talk about the shooting at the hip. Brock, I don't know if I would have said those things about Paradise. That they were happy to be here, and that their fans were cheering them. Of course, their fans were cheering them. That was a epic, a signature loss for them. I know they don't necessarily believe in moral victories at a point, but when I'm looking at that from an objective sense, I think that Paradise gained a lot of respect around the state with the way they played Brock, especially given the fact that they should have beaten Brock in most iterations of how that game turned out. You look at Whitesboro at the point that they, again, from that Brock point, that 39-35 game against Brock, that the 69, 60, 65, and 42 defensively is more where I'm impressed. They gave up 7 to Paradise the first time. They gave up 29 to Ponder, but again, Ponder has a kind of a weird offense, and some of that was against second team in the second half. They did give up 15 in the first half, so certainly Ponder did put up some points against first teamers, but Ponder pretty much did that against everybody. But then in the playoffs, 6 to Vernon, 15 to Dalhart, and 14 to Paradise. And by and large, the Dalhart and Paradise touchdowns were all against second teamers. So I'm seeing Whitesboro playing defense at a high level. That's a little bit different than what I'm seeing out of Brock. Brock is beating the teams that they're supposed to beat, but they're beating them in the ways that they're expected to beat them. When you look at Brock's playoff road and how they got there, and if you even want to put it up against a computer poll, for instance, they were big favorites over Iowa Park, and they beat Iowa Park 48-0. And I've seen anywhere between 35 and 40 points that they were favorited to win that game. Brock against Muleshoe, they were favorited by 33. They won that game by 37. I know people will say, well, they were scoring late. But again, we talk about Whitesboro, and we have the same things. Whitesboro had teams scoring late against them. The Bushland-Brock score, again, even though it was 51-27 on paper, 37-27 was probably more indicative of how that went. But Whitesboro, even if you want to ignore the Whitesboro-Paradise game, the second game, because of the fact that they didn't have Austin Iglesias, if you just look at Whitesboro and Paradise 1 versus Brock and Paradise 1, Whitesboro looks like they calibrated a little bit better in that game. If you look at Paradise and you look at, or if you look at Whitesboro and Brock, the first game, both of them had turnovers, so that was definitely a significant issue. But Whitesboro had that really unfortunate kickoff return that was able to get Brock that one more possession to get back in the game. If they didn't have that, Whitesboro was likely going to win at that level. But the fact that obviously the game is the game, but Brock has consistently had those 1 to 2 turnovers, but Whitesboro has not, especially after that point. They've had a fumble here and there, second teamers in the late game, but Whitesboro has played very clean, effective football from the penalty side and from the turnover side pretty consistently in that 8 weeks. So when I look at this game, I think Brock has a higher ceiling, and this is where people are going to accuse me of talking out of both sides of my mouth. Because I think if Brock plays an absolutely clean, perfect game where they have no turnovers and no special teams errors, they are probably the better team on paper. Their athletes are probably a little bit better, but they have not shown anything this year, not one iota of playing that level of football for 48 minutes. They've had good halves, they've had bad halves, but they haven't put together a 48-minute game against a good team where you can look at Brock and go, that team can win a state title. They have been predictably flawed in ways where Brock is going to make 1 or 2 mistakes in every single game that is going to cost them points. Whereas Whitesboro, they didn't make the mistakes against Brock, and Brock may force a mistake or two against them just because Brock's defense is that good. But Whitesboro has shown more of a consistency in playing that clean level of football. So even if we have a situation where it's 2 turnovers and 2 turnovers and 1 turnover or 1 turnover, I think Whitesboro should be considered the favorite in this game. And the second thing that I look at is what new wrinkles are they putting in that we talked about it with South Oak Cliff and Javon Thomas and Even Jaden Hardy, a Louisville player on the defensive side of the ball, has started to run the ball. And Denton Geyer has Jackson, since we're going to be at Collins, we can talk a little bit about Denton Geyer. Jackson Arnold had hardly run the ball at all in the regular season, and now he's pretty much a good chunk of their offense because they need that. What is that thing that Brock can point to that is just categorically different from the way they played earlier in the year? Because they're pretty healthy, and that's a good thing. Whitesboro did suffer a pretty bad injury against Paradise, but it wasn't, it was more special teams and defensive depth. A broken leg, and it was a horrible scene. I'm glad. That's one time I'm glad I'm not refereeing or being on the field because I can't handle those kind of things. But I mean, when you hear people talking about the screaming and you got people calling for the carts within seconds of things happening, you just obviously hate to see that. And we have here at the District 4 3A podcast, we have nothing but prayers and thoughts for that young gentleman who had whatever leg, a lower body injury, as they like to call it, generically happen. But it's not a player that we talk about every single week. I remember his name, but I mean, it's not a player that we're talking about being a playmaker or an offensive side of the ball. So on the level of a personal level, as a teammate, obviously we're very sad, but it's not a game-changing injury from a strategic level like Austin Iglesias was, for instance, with Whitesboro. So both teams are pretty much, at peak levels of healthiness. Grayson Ledbetter has had injuries throughout the year, but he seems to be playing at a high level. Mac Harper seems to be playing at a high level. Brett Donaldson, Carter Schluter is playing at a high level. But Max Parker, I think, is the X factor that Whitesboro can point to and say, that's something that Brock didn't see that we're going to have against Brock. That is going to be an extra wrinkle that Brock has to deal with. Brock, that Brett Tutter is seeing the ball a little bit more. Reed Watkins is playing at a high level. But again, Tyler Moody is playing at a high level right now. But all of those are prone to make one or two fumbles, one or two interceptions in the game. They are not playing perfect football, whereas Grayson Ledbetter has very good ball control. Mac Harper has thrown an interception. He's not perfect, but he makes good decisions. He's not slinging it into triple coverage or trying to make a play. He's willing to give up the down for another play. So they're playing smart football. It shows how well coached they are. And I think Brock has done a good job getting Tyler Moody to that extent more now than at the beginning of the game. So a smarter, wiser Tyler Moody is definitely something that Brock can point to, as well as Brett Tutter playing more. But again, it's pretty much the same Brock we've seen all year. And Brock keeps talking about, I was listening to the halftime show with Bushland, if they would have made a few more blocks, if, that's kind of Brock's story this year. If this would have happened, if that would have happened. But for whatever reason, we have seen now through 13 games that they are not executing those little things consistently that they need to execute to be at that next level. So in talking out of both sides of my mouth, I think Brock is a more flawed team than Whitesboro. Whitesboro is playing at a high level. They're playing more likely to play at the top of their ceiling than Brock, who is kind of being up and down and will have a great half and then a bad half and have a couple of turnovers. I like Whitesboro in a 35-31 type of game against Brock. And I think that they will take and they will finally ascend to that next level. They can look at the Pottsboro game, they can look at the Bells game, but this is the game that they have been looking forward to because we know to be the man, you got to beat the man. And Brock has earned the title of being the man. And it's kind of ironic because if you look at the Region 2 battle, Malakoff and Grandview, they played earlier in the year as well. Grandview beat Malakoff, and I'm going to be taking Malakoff to beat Grandview. So both games, both the Region 1 and the Region 2 finals are rematches. One is a district rematch, and the other is just a rematch from non-district. But I am picking both teams that have lost to win and overcome those battles. The game, regardless if it's Whitesboro, Brock, Grandview, and Malakoff, will be played next Thursday at the Star. So we are guaranteed semifinal action at the Star. And the District 4 3A report will be here to talk about whether it's Whitesboro or whether it's Brock. But it takes courage for me to pick against Brock, because Brock has been a team that has earned everything that they've had. When Brock was 0-4, I was hammering for them to be still state ranked, and I still kept them as my number one team, and I kept Whitesboro at anywhere. Whitesboro was pretty much unranked until that Brock game, and you can see after that Brock game. But again, the teams that I had ranked were Malakoff and Grandview and West, and I mean some very good teams in Region 2, because that's part of our district. We had District 4, 5, 6, and 4, 5, and 6, and 8, I think, or yeah, 4, 5, 6, and 8 were the districts that I consider the North Texas DFW area. So Whitesboro has definitely improved week after week. You look at the Paradise, you look at the Paradise, Whitesboro, Bushland, that kind of circle. All of these things indicate that Whitesboro should be considered the favorite in this game. You look at the turnovers, you look at the penalties, and you look at kind of that expected max of the ceiling. Whitesboro has been there at every single step of the way. Again, if Brock plays a perfect game, I think if you put them on Madden and you put them on computer mode and you don't have coaches and you don't have mistakes, Brock's players and talent from 1 to 22 is probably a little bit better. And if you simulated that season out over 100 games, Brock is probably going to win 60 of those 100 games. But this Brock team that we have seen is consistently making mistakes, consistently having mental errors, and not consistently generating those mistakes and errors out of their opponent. Meanwhile, Whitesboro has found that light switch, and they're playing at a high level. You got to take the Bearcats in this game. So I am taking the Bearcats. I will be there on Thursday night to see if I'm right or wrong. And I'm sure Brock fans will let me know all about it, and they'll tell me all the circles I talked in and how and I probably made a couple of mistakes in my reasoning, because I didn't see the game, and I haven't seen all of the games. I've seen him play Gunter, and I saw the end of the Whitesboro game, or the end of the Paradise game and the end of the Whitesboro game on TV. But other than that, I've only seen Brock in person once, and I've seen Whitesboro in person for a full game once. And that game against Paradise, I don't think you can put too much weight into it because of the Austin Iglesias thing. However, Whitesboro still played at a high level, still scored more than anybody did against Paradise, and part of it was short fields. But again, if you would have extrapolated that over 4 quarters, Whitesboro probably could have scored 63 to 70 if they wanted to do what Brock did, which was play 48 minutes and not pull off the break. But that's just the different styles. There's something to be said for Coach Mathis's style, and there's something to be said for Coach Fagan's style. I don't have an opinion on which one is better, but again, you cannot look at that Brock 51 to 27 score independent of the fact that Brock made 3 huge mistakes in the first half, and 14 points were scored on 15 yards of field the last 3 minutes of the game, whereas other people could have just taken knees and tried to run out the clock and take your win and go home. So that is my analysis of the District 4 3A report, episode 15. We will see if taking Whitesboro or not was the wise decision next week. And regardless of who wins, we will be back here to support them against Grandview or Malakoff in the state semifinals, so we can go one more round and take this all the way to AT&T Stadium and 17 episodes of Season 2. So for all of our friends in Pilot Point who are making me sound like $1 million, Chance, go ahead and get the Ric Flair montage out. I know Brock's theme this year in their playoff is wrestling, so to end this thing, we'll say, to be the man, you've got to beat the man. And right now, Brock is the man, but Whitesboro is ready to be Sting in 1992 and knock off the man, and I think they have earned the right to be there and to be in a main event match. And Ric Flair was a 17-time champion, which means he lost 17 times. So, Brock, I'm saying your title reign is ending at the hands of the Whitesboro Bearcats. See you down the road.
Later today, Ric Flair will be going, as many people say, for the final time for the World Heavyweight title. For a man who's won it 5 times, Rick, How does this extra pressure affect you?
Well, what it tells me, Lance Russell, is today, I've got the style and profile like never before. Steamboat, let me go on record as telling the whole world you are the greatest wrestler on the face of this earth. But, pal, today, right here, you gotta beat Ric Flair one more time. Remember, Steamboat? And, pal, I'll kiss your boots if you can do it. But to be the man, you gotta beat the man. And I'm saying, right here in Nashville, Tennessee, pal, I'm the man. Ric Flair and Steamboat, you're gonna be mine. Woo! 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 I ain't leaving.